All right, so our last lesson is on human population growth and ecology. And over the last century, through agriculture, medical and technological advances, the human population has been really growing somewhat out of control and has been going beyond its what would be the natural limits of a normal population. And using models and equations, human population scientists have made some predictions about just how long our current population growth can continue until we finally do reach the carrying capacity of our environment, of our globe. And with this out of control population growth, as you imagine, comes many environmental problems. And in today's lesson, we will examine the nature of human population growth and look at the various factors that can influence it, in particular, the human impact on the environment and looking at our environmental footprint. We will look at the effect of human population growth on personal consumption and technological development on our ecological footprint. We will assess on the basis of research the effectiveness of some Canadian technologies and products that have been put in place intending to nourish the expanding population, and also explain the concept of energy transfer in human population in terms of the flow of the food energy and the production, distribution, and use of food resources. Now, this graph down here is a summary of the historical population growth over the past centuries. And just going to move it up a little bit more so that here you have the year and population on the vertical axis in the billions. And what you will note is that, yes, it's an exponential growth. And you will notice that there isn't really any large fluctuations in human population growth that you can really, excuse me, notice and associate with famines or wars. And this exponential growth rate in human population has such a powerful upward acceleration that it doesn't really reflect any of the historic events that may have caused reductions in population size, with the exception of this blip over here that you will notice, which is associated with the period of the Black Death or the Black Plague that took place in Europe, which produced this very noticeable, but quite small on the scale of things, this downward little spike in the curve, this dip in the curve. And even all the loss of life that took place, even during World War I and World War II, aren't really showing up very much on this type of a graph, at least not at this scale. And so this population growth has really occurred at an astounding rate. And from the 1950s to the 1990s, if we look, we'll see that the population has nearly doubled from 2.5 billion to 5 billion, right? Very much so. And this doubling time of in about 40 years is actually even less than the average human life, right? So the population has really been growing at an accelerated rate, and the population passed 6 billion just before the end of the 20th century. Currently, we're at 8 billion, and it's estimated that every hour, more than 10,000 new people are born into the world, which is a rate of approximately 3 people per second, 3 babies born every second. And the factors that affect the global human population can really boil down to 4 factors, very simply: fertility, mortality, our initial population, and the time span that we are looking at. And although currently the growth rate is approximately 1.3% per year, this is smaller than it has been previously. At its peak between 1965 and 1970, it was at nearly 2.1% per year. And so even so, it is currently this 1.3% per year is being applied to a much larger population than what it used to be. And this means that the number of births that are the very large number of 90 million per year is at really an all-time high. So the idea of trying to stabilize human population really requires a very significant reduction in fertility globally. And this is, in fact, a very difficult prospect. So fertility is one of the, currently one of the major factors that drive the current growth of human population. And fertility or birth rate can be studied at according to country in more developed countries. So we can look at this graph here. And from that, we can see that in more developed countries, you have lower fertility rates. So in more developed countries, you see in purple, there's the total fertility rate, and compared to this bluish purple color here, which is female literacy rate. And by looking at this across, so this is in developed countries and this is in less developed countries. And if you really compare to the two, you will see that in more developed countries, there's a lower fertility rate compared to less developed countries. And so population growth and the level of development in the country, including literacy, in particular female literacy, are clearly linked in this way. And fertility is also very largely controlled by economics and the human aspiration to have a better life. And the high fertility that we see in developing countries are really as a result, partially at least, from the need for there to be a large number of people to do agricultural work. And in these rural areas, if you have large families, you have somewhat of an economic advantage over those who have smaller families. But as technology improves and parents realize that having more children decreases, rather increases their standard of living, then you have, with that realization comes fewer births and a reduction in the rate of fertility. And a very obvious example of this type of effect is one that took place in Thailand, when the population started to realize that their future economic status was very much linked to secondary schooling of their offspring. And Thai parents began paying additional expenses to really educate their children. And in as little as a decade, this type of change resulted in a large decrease in fertility rate from about 6 children per couple to only 2 children in couple, which really increased the standard of living for most families. And so looking at fertility rates is one useful way of looking at human population growth rate, but it's also important to look at the demographics of that existing population. And demography is referred to as the study of the characteristics of a population, such as their age, their density, the distribution, or even economic status. And this type of study provides, excuse me, really important information to allow the prediction of future growth rates. And one of the demographics that is studied by scientists is the age distribution within a population. And this information can be displayed in these types of population age pyramids. And here we have a comparison between the population age pyramid in a developing country versus a developed nation. So if we look at these two and compare and contrast them, we can see that this type of population age structure in developed nations, and an example of this might be in Western Europe, this represents a stable population where the pyramid shape is a bit more rectangular than this very triangular shape of a rapidly growing population in a developing country, such as ones that you might find in West Africa. And the developing country has a much larger number of younger people. So if you look at the base where the age, low age is down here, so younger population here, you can see it's very broad at the base. So it has a much, excuse me, larger number of young people. And then if you could even look at the male and female side of the pyramid, you can see that the female side of the diagram is actually very important in helping us to understand what is the future growth, because fertility is largely controlled by the number of females of reproductive age. And by reproductive age, we mean typically between 15 years of age to 40. So in this, this mid part of the population pyramid. And it can take sometimes many decades or even centuries to really take this slope that you associate with a developing country and really steepen it up to become more like those of developed countries. But this steepening is very important as populations. It's important to see this type of steepening if you have any hope of stabilizing the growth of that population. And there's been many countries that have tried to implement various ways to control their population. In China, it used to be that there was a very aggressive and controversial population control called the one child per family policy, but it had the effect of bringing remarkable change to the age structure and the population size of that country. So population age pyramids are very important, and it's very important to be able to see and visualize the effect of the population and fertility based on age. And mortality, or in other words, death rate, is another large determining factor of population growth. And in the developing world, you have death rates that are continuously decreasing and dropping, and there have been many reasons for this decrease in the mortality rate in developing worlds. And some of these, as you can imagine, include things like improvements in personal hygiene and improved methods of sanitation, the advancements in modern medicine, and, for example, development of antibiotics. And you can see by looking at this picture, for example, looking at a few samples of countries, and you can see that overall the death rate has been decreasing but there has been decreases. You can associate that market decrease with events that are associated with improvements in personal hygiene, such as the use of soap or improved sanitation. And then finally, a bit more recently, modern medicine and the use of antibiotics have really helped to decrease the global death rate in many, many countries. Hi, Patrick. I am just going to take a quick moment to update my attendance sheet for Patrick, Ahmed, and Natalie. And I must say the three of you have had impeccable attendance rate, and thank you for that. That's been wonderful, and good for you for not having missed a single class. So this type of decreased death rate, along with decreases in birth rate because of changes in the economy, has really had a very profound effect that we can see on the population growth curves of the developed countries. So this type of graph that shows a demographic transition model. And the demographic transition model is what the term that is given to the process that has occurred over the last century and has led to more stabilized population growth in developed nations. So if we look at that, we can see that we have a total population that, as it's going up, in the blue shows the total population. In purple, we have the death rate, and in red, we have the birth rate. So you can see that initially, for a country that is in the pre-industrial phase, we might have very large rates of births and deaths occurring. And so that would keep the total population quite low. But as the country may enter a transitional phase where it is, sorry, lost my page. And so during this pre-industrial phase, you have low total population that's pretty steady in terms of growth. There is a large number of births and deaths. They're both quite high. Modern medicine hasn't really yet developed, is not in place to really extend life. And there probably is very little use of proper personal hygiene. During stage 2 or phase 2, this transition state, slowly the standards of hygiene increase, and there's more modern medical techniques, which began to affect the death rate. As you can see in this transitional state, death rates slowly start to drop and lead to really a significant, together with the drop of the death rate, that you can see there is a big significant upward trend in the total population. Still, the birth rate remains pretty high, as in this stage, still typically the economy is still very much dependent and agricultural based. So at this stage, it's still very important for those families to have large number of members in order to farm the land and to take care of the land. During the phase 3, also a transitional phase, in this stage, urbanization has started to occur. And as the cost of being able to support an urban family, an urbanized family now starts to grow, parents are more actively discouraged from having large families because they're not necessarily required so much in an urban setting, whereas they were in a rural setting where they would be relying on the manpower for agriculture. And this causes a drop in birth rates now in this third stage of transition. And and so as a result, this drop in birth rate and the death rate pretty much causes a stabilization to occur, a stabilization in population growth slowly. And during this time, where there was a development in Europe, there was an increasing population that led to large-scale migration, for example, to North America, and also extensive global colonization took place in this type of a transitional phase. And finally, in stage 4, which is the last stage of the demographic transition, this last stage is characterized by a higher population, although still not quite stable, a higher population size, and both birth rates and death rates are both relatively low, although there's still quite a bit of fluctuation there. And so population growth at this stage is now slowly starting to approach 0. It's still undulating a bit, but it's slowly approaching 0. And here in the developed world, which is in the industrial phase, largely remains in this stage, and its demographic transition remains at this 4th stage. So by looking at the various stages in different countries, by looking at the demographics of different countries, you can really determine by looking at their total population, their death rate, and their birth rate, you can determine what stage during this type of transition, as is modeled here, a certain country might be in. And these types of transition, is thought that will occur in all countries, or at least that's the model suggested, as they become further developed. However, this development will take time, and so depending on different countries, this might be stretched out on a different time scale. So how do we maintain and take care of our growing population? Well, quite a large amount of the world's total land area is considered not arable. And what this means is that it is not suitable for agriculture, for farming, for growing food. Only about 10% is considered to be arable land. And this 10% is not evenly distributed throughout the globe. There are some regions of the world that have an abundance, are blessed with fertile soils and favorable climates, while there are some other regions that would have very poor soil conditions that would be very prone to drought and flooding and other harsh conditions that make it very difficult to grow food. And approximately a third of the world's land surface is not able to support any or very little vegetation. So this type of land usually is the type of land that you might think of as deserts or urban areas, or the land of in Antarctica, even mining sites that have been totally depleted of any type of a fertile topsoil. And most of the land that has not been used for agriculture is either too steep or too wet or too dry or too cold to be used for agriculture. And worldwide, per capita, the amount of cropland is really on the decline. And the most severe loss of agricultural land is as a result of soil degradation. That, together with another reason for the loss of cropland, is urbanization. Urbanization is another reason. And so increasing the yields of crops from whatever available farmland seems to be really the key point to increasing food production. So techniques such as selective plant breeding have been used to produce higher yielding varieties of crops such as rice or corn, wheat, sorghum, etc. But unfortunately, these high yielding varieties reduce the genetic diversity that we have and increases the crop's vulnerability to pests and disease, which means that then these crops might become more dependent on the use of pesticides. These crops would also typically then become very dependent on the need for fresh water and technology when you're planting these crops, which isn't always available as an option in developing countries. So food, which is critical for human survival, and there's been much improvements in food technology since the 1950s that have led to better food production. Although food production has now declined over the past 15 years or more, actually, I would say, we are still able to produce enough food on a global scale to be able to adequately feed all of the world's population. So the principal cause of hunger is actually poverty. Of the 6 billion people, I think this number is out of date. I think we're now at 8 billion people. Of these 8 billion people, half of them live in poverty, and at least 1/5 of them suffer from severe malnourishment. The minimum amount of food energy that an average person must intake every day is 9,900 joules. And there is approximately 500 million people who typically consume less than this per day, and 2/3 of them live in Asia, Africa, and South America. Where do we get our food? Our three major sources of food are livestock, things like cows and sheep and goats, ocean fisheries, and then grain production. For livestock, raising livestock has really led to the degradation of forests in Central and South America, And this is because of the need to cut down and burn down large swaths of the rainforest in order to create grazing lands for these animals. And sometimes doing so has led to the introduction of foreign species, which then become invasive species. So raising livestock produces 130 times more waste than humans do, which can end up getting into drinking water, polluting waterways, drinking water, and affect the fish population, lead to the loss of fish species as a result of toxic algal blooms, which will happen as a result of too much organic waste present in waterways. So really, there is a problem with raising livestock. In terms of ocean fisheries, fishing catches have reduced also due to pollution in our oceans, due to global warming, and damage to aquatic habitats, and over-harvesting or overfishing. So that has been an area of problem for ocean fisheries as well. For the production of our grain that we consume, it is more energy efficient, certainly, to consume grain products than it is to consume livestock. And you may be wondering, how is that? And to understand this, we have to take a look at the food energy pyramids. And I think most of you are quite familiar with these types of food energy pyramids. So we have the different levels here that represent the different groups of organisms that might compose a certain food chain that we may be looking at. So starting by looking at the very bottom of the pyramid, you have the producers down here. And these typically bring energy from non-living sources into this community through photosynthesis. So at this level, you have plants, and here you have an example of grass. Then you have the primary consumers, which would eat these producers. And typically these are herbivores in most of these communities that we look at. And then you have the secondary consumers that eat the primary consumers. Here, the secondary consumer might be the frog, who might eat the grasshopper, who feeds on the grass. So these secondary consumers are typically carnivores. And then you have the tertiary consumers, which would then feed on the secondary consumers. So the snake that would eat the frog that would eat the grasshopper that would feed on the grass. And finally, at the very top, you have the quaternary consumer. And in some food chains, there is this fourth consumer level that will eat the tertiary consumer level, and sometimes there's even a fifth. So at the top here, we have the hawk, which would eat the snake that has been eating the frog, that eats the grasshopper, that feeds on the grass. So energy then flows through this system quite inefficiently. As one moves up these trophic or feeding levels, about 90% of the energy is lost to the environment, and only about 10% of the energy that is consumed gets passed to the organism in the next level. to be more energy efficient, humans can get more energy by eating more of the producers, more of the grains, the vegetables, and the fruits directly, rather than from eating, than feeding these producers to the livestock and then subsequently eating the livestock products, the cattle or the cows or the goats or the sheep. So eating organisms that occur earlier in the food chain or the energy pyramid can sustain a larger population in countries that have insufficient food production. So in other words, again, these primary producers, the grains, the vegetables, the fruit. And so today we have about 36% of the world's grain that gets diverted to feed livestock instead of feeding people. And this, if this amount was just reduced by 10%, 67 million tons of grain could be made, can be further made available to sustain more people, 225 million people. Water is another important resource. If we look at water, over 70% of our Earth's surface is covered by water. And although water, seemingly when you look at the globe, seems very abundant, there is actually very little fresh water. And the water cycle that takes place on Earth is essentially a closed system, meaning that we always have the same amount of water. 97.5% of all the water that we have on Earth is not fresh water, it is salt water. And this leaves really only 2.5% of the available water as fresh water. And of this 2.5%, 70% of it is tied up, frozen in the polar ice caps. And most of the remainder of this fresh water is then present in soil as moisture, or is found really deep in underground aquifers and as underground water that is not very much accessible for human use. So this leaves really less than 1% freshwater, total freshwater, that is accessible to us for our use. And you can see the per capita water use across the various continents, and you can see that North America has got, North and Central America have got the highest amount of per capita water use compared to other areas such as Africa, South America, Asia, even Europe and former USSR, Russia. So agriculture is responsible for the consumption of 87% of the total water that is used globally. And a great deal of this water is returned to the earth through surface runoff, but it's usually contaminated either through fertilizer or animal waste product. The World Health Organization has estimated that more than 5 people each year die from the diseases that are caused by unsafe drinking water and a lack of sanitation and clean water for drinking. And it is believed that fresh water will be the critical limiting resource for many regions on Earth in the very near future. That about 1/3 of the world's population lives in countries that even currently are experiencing a water shortage. And as the world population continues to grow, as is at this rapid growth rate, well, there will be even greater demand on freshwater supplies. This, together with the ever decreasing supply of fresh water due to pollution and contamination, means that ultimately there will be even more pressure placed on our freshwater resources. And some of the solutions may be in the improvement in the efficiency of water use through proper water management and the development of modern technologies. But water would be certainly less likely to be wasted if its price was allowed to rise, and incentives for the conservation and investments into creating more efficient water technologies would also increase this. Air, the other important resource, air, and we should talk about this as more countries become industrialized. There's more pollutants getting into the Earth's atmosphere, and this increase in air pollution has really caused enormous damage to the environment and caused enormous increases in human health problems as well. Then there is the problem of acid rain. And acid rain is generally caused by industrial emissions of compounds that contain sulfur, nitrogen, and carbon. And when these react with water molecules up in the atmosphere, so we can look at this, it produces acid rain. And this acid rain, this acid precipitation, is a diluted sulfuric acid, nitric acid form that gets deposited in the form of acid rain or snow, or even on gas and dust particles. And this acid precipitation has the problem that it can erode historical buildings, it can change the soil's pH, and this will ultimately affect the growth of crops and forests and change the pH of water sources, which can then lead to even more adverse effects on fish populations. The other concern that is linked to air pollution is global warming and climate change. And both of these are linked to the phenomenon that is known as the greenhouse effect. And I'm sure most of you are quite familiar with the greenhouse effect. And excuse me for 1 minute. We lost the student here. So yes, most of you are familiar with the greenhouse effect. And you know that the greenhouse effect involves specific gases in the Earth's atmosphere, such as water vapor, carbon dioxide, and methane. And these gases are able to absorb heat. And some of these gases arise from human activity, while some of them are naturally occurring, but burning of fossil fuels releases enormous amounts of carbon dioxide, for example, into the atmosphere each year. And there are waste sites that release enormous amounts of methane. Automobiles release nitrous oxide and more carbon dioxide. So these gases will allow visible light and even some ultraviolet light from the sun to pass through the atmosphere to the Earth's surface, but when this light is absorbed, most of it is reflected back as infrared radiation or heat, and this gets absorbed by the greenhouse gases. And this leads to the creation of a thermal blanket of sorts in the atmosphere, which will then result in that characteristic change in temperatures. And when these atmospheric gases increase as a result of human activity, you have an increase in global warming. And it's very hard to try and predict what are the impacts of these changing concentrations of these greenhouse gases. But one thing is agreed among climate specialists is that the average atmospheric temperatures are certainly rising, and that an increase in greenhouse gases is due to human activity. And human activity is the main contributing cause of the increase in greenhouse gases. Many feel that we will see, as a result of climate change and global warming, that we will see some of the following, such as higher temperatures, changing landscapes. There'll certainly be more wildlife at risk. There'll be rising ocean and sea levels, increased droughts, fire, and floods, stronger storm activity, and as a result, increased damages from these stronger storms, more heat-related illnesses and disease, and ultimately large economic losses. So how much land does it take to support each person's particular lifestyle? That would be each person's ecological footprint. The ecological footprint is that measure of the amount of nature's resources that an individual or a community or a country consumes in a given year. The ecological footprint measures the amount of the biologically produced land and sea area that an individual or all of humanity or a certain activity or a region even requires to produce the sources that it consumes. It also considers those resources that are required to absorb the waste that is generated, and also the carbon dioxide that is released by the burning of fossil fuels. And then this value is compared to how much land and sea area is left available. So here we can see that the ecological footprint, this is the world's biocapacity, and here's the number of planet Earths, for example, that would be available. And you can see we are clearly exceeding the number of even planet Earths that is required to be able to sustain our biological footprint. So these biologically productive land and seas include areas that are able to support human demand for food and fiber, timber, energy, and space for the infrastructure, and to be able to absorb the waste products from human activity. And biologically productive areas are areas that include croplands, forests, fisheries, but not areas such as deserts and glaciers and open ocean. The Earth's biocapacity here is the amount of biologically productive area that is available to meet humanity's needs. And we can see that since the 1980s, the ecological footprint has really exceeded the Earth's capacity. And basically, the Earth's regenerative capacity can no longer keep up with what has been the human demands. So humans are turning these resources into waste at a much faster rate than nature is capable of turning the waste back into usable resources. And as a result of this, there's this growing pressure on the ecosystem that is causing habitat destruction. One second, I'm just going to take a look at this message here. Okay, I'm sorry, Patrick is having some trouble. Hopefully he can listen to this lesson later. So where were we? Yeah, so there's this growing pressure on the ecosystem that is resulting in habitat destruction and the permanent loss of productivity and threatening both biodiversity as well as human health. Currently, ecological footprint standards use global hectares as a measurement unit, which makes the data and results globally comparable. So a global hectare is a common unit that includes the average productivity of all biologically productive land and sea areas in the world in a given year. So by using this common unit, different types of land can be compared by using this common unit as a denominator, a common denominator between the both. The other indicator that can be used is the living plant index. The living plant index is another indicator of the health of the planet's ecosystem and the global biodiversity. And it is based on trends in some over 1,300 vertebrate populations of species from all around the world. And since the 1970s, this index has fallen about 30%, which suggests that we are degrading our natural ecosystem at a rate that has been unprecedented in humans' history. So this living plant index provides stakeholders, and by stakeholders, we mean both the general public as well as scientists and policymakers and governments, with the information that is needed on the trends of these vertebrate populations, and then gives an insight into which habitats or ecosystems have species that are declining most rapidly, and then to help guide the type of policy making and the decisions that can help to reverse that. Now, what has been Canada's role in these types of global initiatives? Canada's used to have a Canadian International Development Agency, which has now been absorbed into Global Affairs Canada. And the aim here is to reduce global poverty, promote human rights, and support sustainable development. And Global Affairs Canada works closely with other federal departments and many different kinds of Canadian organizations, international organizations, and other countries, and of course, the developing countries themselves. And they generate funding to fund international development programs and projects through contributions to Canadian international institutions. And this agency is also enters into various contracts with various Canadian companies to try and implement programs and projects, many of which will have the focus on education, on the environment, on health, on bringing equity between both women and men, as well as humanitarian aid and developments in the private sector. One example of one of these projects is the flour fortification program. Canada's Wheat Board and the International Grain Institute is a member of an international organization looking at the fortification of white flour with specific amounts of vitamins such as thiamine, riboflavin, niacin, folic acid, and iron. And with the processing of white flour, a lot of the micronutrients, such as the B vitamins and and iron and folic acid in particular, get lost. So by enriching the flour, we are replacing the nutrients that were lost with through this extensive processing. And this program is really aimed at helping to prevent nutrient deficiencies and to maintain or even improve the nutritional quality of the food supply in foods such as flour that we might be using for our own population, but also donating to struggling countries. There's also the Micronutrient Initiative, which is a Canadian-based organization dedicated to ensuring that the world's most vulnerable, especially women and children in developing countries, get the vitamins and minerals that they need in order to survive. Excuse me. Their mission is to implement and monitor innovative, cost-effective, and sustainable solutions for to improve hidden hunger in partnership with other organizations. So this brings us to the end of our lesson, our last lesson. Any questions? Okay.
Miss, are we gonna have an exam review, like a sheet or something? Or are we just supposed to study off of the units?
So no, there's no exam review, but as I've said before, if you have been doing your assignments, doing the assignments and doing the homework questions that have been attached to each of the lessons, that's really the best way to prepare for looking at the exam, for preparing for the exam. So if you have been doing your lessons, if you've been doing your unit assignment questions, and if you've been attempting at least your homework questions, that should be more than enough preparation for the final exam.
Okay. And are we getting a cheat sheet like the test or no?
Yeah, you guys can bring a cheat sheet with you.
Okay, thank you.
This is a regular 8.5 by 11 cheat sheet, handwritten. You can write both sides. No printing allowed, just a regular handwritten cheat sheet. You can put whatever you like on it. If there's any formulas required, I know some of our lessons had formulas associated with it. Our last lesson was an example of one that had some formulas in it. Some of our questions might require some calculations for some of these formulas. On the back of the exam, I will provide these formulas, but you will have to know how to use them. Okay, you will have to know which situation they are relevant for, what each different part of the formula stands for, and you will have to familiarize yourself with using these formulas.
Okay.
So on Monday next week, same time, same place, we'll do a sort of a tutorial review session. It's very much based on what type of questions you guys might have. And then on Wednesday is our final exam in person at the academy.
Okay, Miss, thank you.
Okay, you're welcome, Natalie.
And so the exams focus is mostly on 4 and 5, right? But maybe
Yeah, I will
some
say the exam, mostly the focus is on 4 and 5. Those are the chapters, the units rather, that you guys have not been tested on previously. But this being a final exam, really, it's open to all the material covered in the course. It is a final exam. But I will say, to be fair, the focus is on 4 and 5. I haven't tested you guys on that yet.
So we would need to like go back and review the Krebs cycle in photosynthesis and that stuff.
That's the idea generally with final exams. But like I said, the focus would be on chapters 4 and 5. But yeah, after you've done learning 4 and 5 inside and out, you might be, you might do well to go back and review chapters 1, 2, and 3.
All right. Okay, thank you.
Okay, no problem, Ahmed.